Hi, welcome back. So the next topic which we are going to discuss is variables. Like every other language, we do have the variable configuration in the Terraform as well. And if you have worked on any other programming language, you know the importance of the variable. So as name implies, it will be variable. Like we can configure the different values whenever we want. So far, we have seen the examples of resource block data sources, and every time when we are putting the values of those argument, we are putting in a plain text. But now let's assume I wanted to create maybe a 50 resources and I'll have to provide the location West Europe, right? So I'll have to put the location West Europe in every resource explicitly, right? And next time if I wanted to make sure like I would like to create the environment in maybe in a DR location and the DR location is somewhere in the UK South. Now I wanted to change the value of this particular location, so I'll have to make sure that I'm changing the value on all 40 resources individually because I'm using the plain text. I'm not using any variable. I just have a plain text as a argument value. So I'll have to make sure that I'm changing the values everywhere where I do have the location West Europe. But with the help of the variable, we can avoid this problem. So in this section, we are going to talk about how to declare the variable, how to configure and how to use the variable. So let's have a look. In variable, we will talk about the variable declaration. We'll talk about the variable arguments. Then we'll talk about the variable definition. And then we'll discuss about how to use the variable. And at the last, we are going to talk about the local variable. That is one of the variable type in Terraform. So let's start with the variable declaration. And before we are looking like how to declare the variable, I'll just provide a little bit brief about the variable. So variable we are using in the Terraform to make sure we have a single source of truth for all the values which we are going to use in a resource block or data sources or wherever we want. Okay, so with the variable we can define the values and then we can use that particular value in the resource block, data sources and everywhere. And now let's assume if I wanted to change any value, I can just change into the variable itself, in the variable definition itself. So first we will declare the variable, what type of variables we do need, and then we will define the value of those variable. Once we have defined the variable, then we can simply use those variables wherever we want in the resource block or the data sources and in our Terraform configuration file. So the process which we are following with the variable is we are declaring the variable, like what kind of a variable I'll need. So let's assume I have to define the name of the resource group. So I know the name is in the character in the letters. So it will be a string type of variable. And we do have multiple type of variable, and when we are going to do the practice and when we are going to do more Terraform expression side, then you'll see the benefit of the variable definition and the variable declaration and different type of variable, what would be the impact on those variable and how easy it would make our code, or it will define our code. So it will be very easy to play with the variable when we are using the Terraform configuration, and it will be very easy to deploy the resources, and we can do a lot of things with this variable declaration and the definition in our Terraform configuration file. So with the help of the declaration, we can declare which kind of a variable we want. Like I want a string variable, I want a number, I want a maybe a boolean to define the true and false. I'll need a variable with some list where I'm providing like multiple values. Then I'll have the variable type called map, which we are gonna see. So first we have to declare the variable and we have to list out all the variables which we would like to have and the type of the variable, and then we are defining the values and then we are using the variable. So there are three steps for the variable: declaration of the variable, definition of the variable, like what value you want to put this into this variable, and then use that variable into the resource block or the data source block. Okay, so let's have a look to the variable declaration, how we define or first how we declare the variable. So to declare the variable, similarly, like any other block in the Terraform, we do have the block for the variable as well, because Terraform is completely on a block basis. So to declare the variable also we need to create a block. But before that, let's have a look to this particular section, variables.tf. On the left side of my window, you can see there is a separate file for the variable. It's completely optional. You don't have to create a separate file, but it's a good practice if you use the variables.tf as a separate file to declare your variable. So everybody knows, whoever reading your code, they knows where you have declared the variable. It's always a good practice to declare the variable in a separate file, but it's completely optional. You can also put the variable declaration code into the main.tf itself. Okay, so we can use a separate file, and it's a good practice to use the separate file, variable declaration file, as a separate variables.tf. Then the block type is variable again, and then the name of the variable. What should be the name of the variable? So I want a variable called location, because I'm gonna assign the value of location in this particular variable. So there are few name which we can't use, except whatever you want you can use, but there are few exceptional words which you can't use, like version, provider, count, because these are the functionality of the Terraform. So you can't use the name of the variable as a version or provider, but you can use the location, you can use the SKU, you can use whatever you want, which is like which is more descriptive based on your code and what you are gonna define into that variable. So for the location, I'm using location in the real time. For the virtual machine size, I'm using virtual machine underscore size or something like that. So this is something we are using as a name of the variable. First thing, the block type, that is variable. Second thing, the name of the variable. So it would be location in my case, or in this case, and then curly braces open and curly braces close, and you can see the block type is the variable, space we do have the variable name. Now similar to the other blocks, we do have the argument and values in the variable as well. So let's have a look. The argument we do have is the type. It's completely optional. Again, if you are not defining the argument type, then by default the variable will be the string. So there is no mandatory argument in the variable block. If you are not using anything, just you can open the curly braces and close it, and the default variable will be created or declared with the default type string. But if you want to override this type, then you are using the type is equal to number, map, list, whatever you want, which we are going to talk about in the next one. So you can define the variable by defining the block type, then the name of the variable, curly braces open, curly braces close, and then as a argument, you can use the type and is equal to a string. And make sure you are not using inverted comma here, like what we were using in the resource block and everywhere for the argument value, because these are the special argument for the variable, where you can define the string for the string characters, letters, and you can define the numbers for the type number if you wanted to use like 1 2 3 4 5. Like if you are putting your virtual machine in availability zone, and we know the availability zone is defining by 1 2 3, so we can use the number as a variable for the availability zone, and then we can use that variable in our virtual machine resource block to define the availability zone. So we do have like different type of variables which we are going to talk about, but this is how we define the or we declare the variable. It's a declaration of the variable where we can use the type is equal to string, and there are a couple of more arguments which we are going to talk about in the next section, but this is how you declare the variable, and I'll let you know how to define the variable, and then we'll see how to use them with the resource block and the data source block. So that's all about the variable declaration. Now the next topic is variable arguments. In this topic, we are going to discuss about what kind of arguments we do have with the variable block. So let's have a look. One of them we already talked about, that is type, but let's have a look. What other we do have? So similar to the output block, we do have the description in the variable. We can also put the variable description just to make sure your code, and it's always a good practice to use the description, because by defining the most of the time we are using the name, the variable name, very descriptive, but in some cases it might not be very descriptive, the name of the variable itself. So you can define the description, like what is the purpose of this variable and where are we using. So like I'm using the location, so I know the description of the location would be the Azure region where the resource should be created, right? So that is how I can define the description. It's completely optional, and but it's a good practice to use, because whenever someone is reading your code, it will be easy for them to understand what is the purpose of this variable, or where are we using and why we are using this variable. So it's always a good practice. I am most of the time in my production code, not most of the time in my production code, I am always using the description. And there is a hack I can tell you. If you don't want to type all this description again and again, what you could do is, when you are going to the Terraform configuration or Terraform documentation for a specific resource type, like I'm creating the NSG, so I can find the documentation in the Terraform documentation for the Azure RM network security group. Then in the network security group documentation itself, they are explaining all the arguments and the purpose of those arguments. So if I'm using the variable for those argument as a argument value, then I can copy the description from the documentation itself, and I can put it into the variable file. But that is something completely optional. If you want to do it, do it. If you don't want, then it's up to you. The next one is again one of the important part, that is default. So if I'm creating a variable, or if I'm declaring a variable, then I'll have to define the value. I'll always have to define the value of that variable. It's mandatory to define the value. If I'm not defining, then my code is going to be error out if I'm using that variable. Even though if I'm not using, still that variable is, whenever I'm executing the Terraform code first find the variable declaration and then try to find the definition or the value of that variable, if we have assigned or not. If we didn't assign, then it will be errored out that this particular variable has not been assigned a value, or it will be prompt to like uh, put the value or assign the value at the time of running the Terraform plan or apply, which is not a good practice again if we are using the CI/CD pipeline. So there are, in the most of the cases, what I am doing is, or in the production environment we are doing is, we are defining a default value. What default value is doing, when we are declaring a variable called location or whatever the variable you want to declare, it will be prompted for the value, assignment value. I want, if someone is not assigning the value for this location, then there should be some default value automatically assigned to that variable, automatically defined to that variable. So I can use default as a default value of that variable. If someone assigning or someone defining the value of that variable, this default value will be overwritten, and the value which someone is assigning or defining will be in use for your Terraform execution. But if you are not defining, if you are skipping that particular value, then default value will be taken into the consideration. And that is again one of the important part, the default value we are using in the production code most of the time, just to make sure that if someone is not providing the value, then we are using this value, or this value is a default value. So West Europe is my default region. So I just wanted to make sure if someone is not explicitly assigning the location value to maybe UK South or something, then only that value should be considered. Otherwise, the default location for any resources should be the West Europe. So we can define the, or we can put a default value for any variable. And most of the time, the Terraform configuration itself, based on the provider, has some default value. So you can use those default value, you can override those default value if you are defining the variable. So we'll talk about it, but is a variable definition, the default value will be considered if you are not defining or assigning any value to any specific variable. So we can put some default value for that variable. The next one we already talked about, that is type. In the type, we do have multiple type. This is what I was talking about. The very first one is the string, which we already saw. So type is equal to string. If I wanted to use some name like resource group name, location name, and whatever we wanted to use is a name or character or word, we can use the string. Okay, and the value of this variable should always be in a inverted comma, because the string is always defined into the inverted comma. If you can see in the default, we have defined the value West Europe in a inverted comma because it's a string. The next type is number. Number is basically another type of the variable which we can have a look. So let's assume I'm defining the virtual machine disk run number. Then I'll have to use the type is equal to number, and the value of this number type should be 1 2 3 or whatever the number you want. And the number should not be with the inverted comma, it should be without inverted comma, because it's a number, and in number we can define directly whatever the value we want. So number we use to provide the number is in definition or the assignment of your variable. The next one is the boolean. Boolean is again important one. So boolean is using where we wanted to do the true and false. So like if I'm configuring the virtual machine variable for the disable password authentication. So if we are creating the virtual machine, the Linux virtual machine, we do have both options. We can use the password authentication or without password authentication. So if I'm using the disable password authentication, then I'll have to make sure either it should be true or false. If I'm doing the true, then the password authentication will be used, disabled or not. So I'm not going to talk about the what is disable password authentication, but as a variable, we can use the Boolean where we want a true and false value. So if you wanted to define either true or false, then you can use the Boolean as a type of your variable. So the next one we are going to talk about is the list. List is again one of the important variable type. We are using list type of variable when we have to define more than one value on for the same variable. So if I'm declaring a variable which can have more than one value, then I can use the list as a variable type. So let's have a look. To define more than one string value or more than one number, we can have the type of list. And to define the value of the list, we always have to use the square braces, and then based on the either it's a list of string or list of number. If it's a list of string, then you have to define into the inverted comma every value. If you can see in my in this example, then you can see we are using the NSD destination port range. So when we are defining the NSD, we can have more than one port is a destination, right? When we are even doing it through the Azure portal, you can see like we can define the destination port multiple time by using the comma every time. So this kind of a value where we can provide or we need more than one value of the variable, we can use the list, and list can have more than one value is a definition of your variable. So we can define multiple values in a list format. Okay, so this is one of the important part or one of the important type in the variable. And you know why I'm saying it's important, because there are multiple Terraform expression which we can do the looping, and we can use list as a loop over. So we talk about it, but you can see we do have one of the type in the variable is the list where we can define multiple values. And the next one is the map. That is even more important than the list, and I'll let you know why. List is basically a type of variable where you can define the value in a key value format. So if you can see on my screen, if I wanted to create a subnets, so for subnet, I'll need the name of the subnet and the address range of the subnet. I can use map to define this kind of a structure, like where I want key and value. And whoever worked on the JSON and the YAML, they knows the importance of the key value pair. So key value pair is helping you to provide more than one value and more than one pair of value which you wanted to use. So we can always use the key and then the value in the map. And when you are defining the map value, you have to start with the curly braces, and then you are using the key and then equal to sign and then the value. And similarly here you can also have the subnet one, and then the inverted comma you can define the address range. So address range is in string, so you can use the inverted comma. You can have the number as a value of your key, but your key should always be a string. You can't define the 1 is equal to 2 or something like that, because key should always be a string. So when we are defining the map value, we can use the key value pair, and key will be unique, and key must be unique, actually not will be but must be unique. If you are using one key as a subnet one, then you can't have another key as a subnet one. That is the important part of the map, because key should always be unique. So subnet 1 is that, subnet 2 is that, but you can't have subnet 1 again. Okay, so that is the limitation. That is the limitation we have, because the map is map we are using with most of the Terraform expressions, and this unique thing we need there to iterate the Terraform expression again and again. And this is something we are going to talk about in the Terraform expression, and I'll let you know why the map is very important when we are using the expression like a for each. Okay, so basically the type of the variable, this type of variable, the map, we can define the value in a key value pair. And you can also have the subnet as a key, and then you can have the list as a value of your key. That is also you can do. So I can put the subnet one in the list like square braces, and then I can provide the multiple value there as well. But in short, map is a key and value pair. So you have to define the, if you wanted to define the value of the map, you always have to use the curly braces, then key is equal to value, key is equal to value. You can have one key value, two key value, more than multiple, like more than two or multiple key value pair you can have in the map. And then you have to close the curly braces. So this is how you define the map is in type of your variable. And the last one is the null. It's not type, but it's a default value of your variable. So type will be the string, but default value. If you can see on my screen, most of the time, oh, always whenever we are using the string, we are putting the string into the inverted comma, the value of the string. But in the case of the null variable, we are using just null without inverted comma. So it's a special definition of this variable, and you when you are going to work on the Terraform with the multiple cases, complex Terraform configuration file, you know that the importance of the null. So we'll talk about it as well. But null is again one of the, it's not the type, but it's a definition of the variable. So type would be the string, but you can have the null as a special definition or special assignment of that variable. So you can also have the null. So that's all about the variable types we do have with the variable block, and we are configuring the variable type as a variable argument. Now let's have a look to the next variable argument, that is the validation. And again, one of the very nice feature I would say in the Terraform configuration it was not there when I started running the Terraform initially, but I think it was introduced a year or more than a year before. What validation is doing? So let's assume I do have a variable and I wanted to make sure the value assignment or value definition value of this variable should be based on some condition, right? I have used this variable location. I'm using this variable in a resource block as a location. And I know the location should be either the West Europe, East Europe, so whatever the location I wanted to have, or whatever the location Azure supports should be configured as a or defined as a location variable. Right? You can't assign or you can't have the location US hyphen West hyphen one, what we do have in the AWS or any other like cloud provider or anything else. So I wanted to make sure whenever someone assigning the value of any variable, that variable should follow some condition, should be validated before the value is assigned to that particular variable. And I can have the multiple like use cases in production. If I would say in my organization we are creating the resources only in the West Europe, I don't want anyone else should create or someone creating the resources in any other location. I can handle this particular configuration on the Azure policy level, but I also wanted to make sure my Terraform code is also handling this condition. What I can do in that case, whenever I am defining the variable, I can put the validation that only this particular location should be assigned, or maybe multiple location like 4 or 5 approved location I wanted to use, not more than that, or not any other like location. So with the validation, we can put the validation on definition or assignment of the variable. So whenever someone is assigning the value, that value will be validated first and then only the assignment has been completed. Otherwise, you will get an error that this value is not supported or whatever the error message you want. So let's have a look how we use the validation. I do have this variable called location. The default value is the West Europe, and I just wanted to make sure this location should have only a couple of location as a approved location. And if someone is assigning any other location, then the assignment should be failed, and on the Terraform plan or the apply level itself, it should be failed. So let's have a look how we are configuring or how we are defining a validation. I have this variable called location. Then I have to extend my curly braces and I have to put the validation as a sub block in the variable block. Okay, and then when we do have the sub block, I'll have to use the curly braces open and the close. And if you have remember the precondition and the post condition, similarly, we have to define the condition here. So the first argument would be the condition, and then I'll use the function called contains, which basically check if that particular variable has the approved value or not. And I just wanted to make sure only West Europe and the UK South is my approved location. So if someone is assigning any other location, then it should be failed. Only this value should be contained by the variable. So whenever someone is defining or assigning the value for the location, it should be either West Europe or the UK South, any of them. It should be contained by that. That's why I'm using the contain as a function of the Terraform. And then by putting the comma, I'll have to use the var dot the name of the variable. And then I can close the contain function. And this is my condition. So my condition is if var dot location contain either the West Europe or the UK South, then only the variable assignment should be successfully done. Otherwise, I should have the error message is equal to incorrect value. Valid values are West Europe and UK South only. So if someone is assigning any other value than West Europe or UK South, then they will get an error message called incorrect value. Valid values are West Europe and the UK South. So this is how we can put the validation on the variable. And this is very important feature because we wanted to make sure someone is when someone is creating the or defining the value, they should always be aligned together. Another use case is whenever I'm using the environment variable just to define my environment, either it's a test, dev, or the prod. So I have seen this, like if I'm creating, I'm using prod, PROD, test, TEST, but my peer, if they are writing the code, they are using PRD or just P or TST, not TEST. So those alignment are not there in the naming convention, then we are like facing some issue with our automation, the automation which depends on the naming convention itself, and then the the complete deployment is not in a good shape, because somewhere we are using the prod, somewhere we are using the PRD, and if someone is using just P, then it's just the messed up of the naming convention and the automation. So I wanted to make sure if they wanted to use the environment name, then they should always use the PROD. So I can put the validation, I can use the contents, and I can put the PROD, TEST, DEFE, and then I can put the condition on the validation of the environment variable itself, and they can use the correct one, and it will be aligned like everywhere. So we can have the validation, we can have multiple kind of a validation, whatever you want. Like if availability zone, I know availability zone is 1 to 3 only. So when I'm defining the availability zone variable, I can use contains 1 to 3 only. Otherwise, if someone is putting the 4, and when the resource block is going to be executed, it will try to find the availability zone 4 in most of the cases. And I don't know any location which does have the availability zone 4 in Azure. So it is going to be failed. So we can handle this kind of a error or this kind of a validation on our Terraform level itself before it is going to the actual resource or the provider and getting failed. So we can put this kind of a validation as well. So that's all about the validation. I hope you understand it. If you don't, then just put it into the comment, and I'll try to answer it as soon as possible. The next one is the sensitive. In the variable argument, we have already seen it into the output block, but here also in the variable, we can have the sensitivity. So sensitive, if sensitive is true, then your variable will be sensitive. And when I'm saying the sensitive, that means whenever we are doing the plan or apply or something like that, this variable will always be hidden in your output, in your plan output, in your apply output. So nobody will be able to see this, because if I'm using the VM admin username, then it's a sensitive value, and I don't want it should be exposed as a plain text. It will be in a plain text in our state file, and that is something we are going to talk about. But in the plan review, in your pipeline logs everywhere, this value will be hidden because it's a sensitive value. So I can use sensitive is equal to true in the variable which does have the sensitive value like password, maybe some API keys or something like that. So we can always use the sensitive is true. The next one is the nullable. Nullable is another argument in the variable. Like I have we already seen the null. I want this VM admin user should not be null, because I know admin user should always be there. Nobody should be able to define admin user variable is a null, because I need a username for this particular variable. So I can have the argument called nullable is equal to false. That means nobody will be able to define or assign the value null for this variable. So with the type string we already saw, we can use the null is a null value for our variable. But if I am configuring the nullable is equal to false, then this value will not accept, the null value will not be acceptable for this particular variable. Okay, so that's all about the variable arguments. I hope you understand it, and I hope I have explained it very well. And if you have any feedback, if I should add something or I should maybe improve something, then just put it into the comment, and I'll try to consider and take in account as soon as possible. That's all about the variable arguments. In the next section, we are going to talk about variable declaration and the arguments in the laboratory way. We'll see how we can use it into the production environment, in the real-time environment, and how we are using it, how we are declaring the variable and using the different variable arguments to define the special conditions of a variable like validation, nullable, or something like that. Hi, so in this section, we talked about the variable declaration and the arguments available for your variable block. In this video, we are going to see in a practical way how we can do the variabilization of our code. And we already write the code for the resource block and the virtual network and network security group. So let's have a look how we can do the variabilization of a code. The first thing, we have to decide what value should be variabilized, what argument of the resource block should be variabilized, and which one should not be. I personally prefer to have everything variabilized, so I can manage it from the variable file or from variable definition file itself. Even though if I'm not changing this value, if the value is the fix, like the location should always be the West Europe in my case. Just an assumption, like location should always be the West Europe. Still, I would prefer to do the variabilization of the location because in future there might be possibility my company is growing and it's just expanding its business to the another region as well in US or somewhere else. So I should have the possibility to expand my code and keep it flexible to adopt the new changes, right? Instead of coming back to the code and changing everything on the code level itself, it's always good to have the variabilization of everything what you have in your resource block. So you can manage it from the variable itself and you don't have to come to the code and change the values in a resource block or in a data source block itself. So that is my personal preference, but if you want, you can keep some values fixed in the code itself and do the variabilization. I personally do the variabilization of everything, and when I'm defining the value, I keep those values as a default, so I don't have to pass the value or put it as an input like a mandatory input argument for your variable. So I keep it on a default and I can keep it optional. If someone is providing, then the value will be replaced. Otherwise, it will be the West Europe always. So that is the purpose of the like doing the variabilization of everything what you have, but it's always up to you how you wanted to manage your code. If you are not expecting it expanding, then you can keep it simple and don't do the variabilization of everything. Let's have a look how we can do the variabilization of this code. First, I'm going to identify the value. So West Europe or the location of the resource block looks a good example to me because I'm providing this value more than one time, right? So what I can do is I can do the variabilization and manage it centrally. So my source of truth would be the variable itself. I don't have to pass this value again and again in every resource block. Okay, so now how we are going to declare it or where we are going to declare it. Either I can have the variable block in my main.tf file itself. That is the first thing. Or I can have the separate file for the variabilization or variable declaration, which is my preference. And it's a good practice to have a separate file for all of your variable declaration. So I'm going to create a new file called variables.tf, and here I can define the variable. We already saw how to know what is the syntax of the variable block. So first you have to put the variable as a block name and then the name of your variable. In my case, it's location. Then what are the arguments we do have with the variable block? So we do have description, default, type, validation, sensitivity, and nullable. Let's start with the description. In description, I can provide the description of the variable. It's just for like a purpose of if someone else is reading your code, he or she should be aware what is the purpose of this variable. So it's just like a purpose of the variable or description of the variable. I generally do a quick hack. I go to the Microsoft Terraform documentation for that particular resource block or whatever it is, and I search for that argument which we are going to variabilize and see the description in the Terraform documentation itself. So the document, as per the documentation, the location is the location region where the virtual network is created. So I can just simply copy it and put it as my description. You can also do the same thing, but if you wanted to have your own custom description, then you can use it. So it's just a description of your variable. Next thing is default, but before talking about the default, I'm going to explain the type. Type we already discussed, like what is the type of the variable. So here the location seems string to me, but let's assume you're not aware what should be the type of your variable. So either you can keep it blank and when you're going to pass the value, the Terraform will decide by its own what should be the type of this variable. So again, this description is optional. The argument for the description is optional. Type is also optional. If you're not passing it, then Terraform will automatically decide the type of this variable. But it's always good to do the hard coding of this type if you know. So I know location is a string in my case. So I can have the type as a string. Now let's see another example. Let's assume again to find out what would be the type of your arguments or the variable, I always prefer the Terraform documentation. Either I know by looking at the value of the variable or argument itself, like address or DNS server. It seems to me a list of string. But if you're not sure, Like what should be the type of this variable if I'm going to do the variabilization of the DNS server. What I can do, I can just simply copy this and search for the description of DNS server. And I can see list of IP addresses of DNS servers. So it's a list. By looking into the value of the argument, you can decide it's a list or map, but if you are not aware, you can always find, uh, like follow the Terraform documentation to identify what is the type of it. Still, if you are confused, then let it be. You can give it blank or you can give it the type and Terraform will decide by its own. Okay. So if I'm defining the DNS server or if I'm defining the address space, because I'm not using the DNS server in our code. So, but the same thing I can say for the address space as well. It's a list. So let me just go and see the virtual network address space. Okay, that looks good to me. I can pass the address space, but the problem is if I use the same name as the address space, I'm going to deploy two more virtual network for the hub and the prod as well. Then it is going to be conflict. You can't have the variable with the same name, like more than one variable with the same name. So what I can do, I know it's a vnet test address space. So what I can do is I can put the name as vnet test underscore address space. So you can use whatever the name you want for the variable. Description again, if you want, you can copy it from the Terraform documentation. So it's a address space for me. The address space is, I can copy the whole, but it's just like up to you. You can use the whole value or just like a quick description about your variable. Type, it's a list. And when we defining the list or the map, we have to pass what kind of a list. List of string, list of number, list of map or something else. To me, it is a list of string because we are passing the address space here in inverted comma. That means it's a string. If it is just number, something like this, not 1 2 3 4 5 6, then it's a list of number. But if it is a list with something like with inverted comma sss ttt or something like that, then it's a list of string. So you can always define based on what is the type of your argument. So it's a list of string for me. Okay, now let's define one more, or declaring one more variable for the tagging. So let's have a look. What is the type of the tag? We already know it's a map, but let's have a look. Mapping of tags to assign to the resources. So description is mapping of tag, type is map. Now I don't know what value is going to be passed for the map key value pair. It could be the value should maybe numbers, right? Or the key maybe number. So anything we can pass in the tag, right? So what we can do if we are not sure what kind of a map it is, like is it a map of a string or the number or something else, then we do have another option called map of any. So it would be a map of any, because we know in the tag you can pass whatever the value you want. You can pass the number, you can pass the string, or you can just pass the string or just number or something like that. So if I'm not sure, I can use the map of any. So I know it's a map, but I don't know what kind of a map it is. So I can put the map of any. It can be a map of list or something like that. So if you're not sure, you can pass the map of any. These are the variable type. So we have declare a variable with a string, list, and map. Now let's talk about the default. We already discussed what is the purpose of the default. Default is basically a default value of your location. So if someone is not passing the value of location, then they can put some default value. Like I want, if someone is not providing the location when running the Terraform code or defining the value of this location variable, then the default value should be taken into the consideration. Okay, so default is the default value of your variable. If when we are defining the value of variable and we don't want this variable to be a mandatory argument or mandatory variable, then we can keep it optional by defining the default value. So when we are running the Terraform code, this particular Terraform code, it will ask vnet address space and the tag, but it will not ask the location. If you wanted to have a look, let's run the Terraform plan, even though we are not using the value, but let's have a look. So when I'm going to run the Terraform plan, it is asking the tag, right? So I'll just put something key, and I know map is key value pair. So this is what I'm going to provide. It is asking me the vnet test address. So I can put the 192.168/24, right? Now, if I hit enter, Basically, I have declared three variable, but it is asking for the value for just two, tag and the VNet address. But technically, it should ask for the location as well, but it will not ask for the location. Why? Because if I want, I can provide the value of the location, but default value is there. That means it's optional. I wanted to provide, then it will be override. If not, then the default value will be taking into the consideration. So that is the purpose of the location and the default argument of the variable. So we talked about the description, we talked about the type, and we talked about the default. Okay, so we are not using these values. That's why there is no infrastructure changes, and it didn't ask me for the location. So if now the variable of the location is the optional, but these two variables are mandatory. That's why when I'm running the Terraform plan command, it is asking me to provide the value. Otherwise, the Terraform plan will not run because you have declared the variable, but you didn't provide the value of the variable, which we are going to talk about in the variable definition section, like how we can define the value or assign the value of the variable type, what kind of a types we do have to assign the value, which we are going to discuss in the next videos. But for now, the default is the one way of defining or assigning the value for your variable. So that is the purpose of the default. Now let's talk about the validation. I want my location to be validated before assigning or before running the code. So I have like some expected value for my location. Only this value should be accepted as a correct argument. By default, you can provide the location like all the Azure region is a location. But in my case, I wanted to do some standardization that only the East or US location and the Europe location should be accepted for the variable, the location variable. My code or my the whole code should not be executed or should not be deployed to any other region than the US and the Europe. So what I can do, I can put the validation for the location. So it's not just for the location, for any variable. If you wanted to put some validation, like only this value should be accepted, then you can use the validation block and you can put your condition. So validation block is a sub block of the variable block itself. The first thing we have to pass in the validation block is the condition. The output of the condition should be true or false. So whatever the condition you wanted to put, you can put here. So for in my case, I want only a specific location or Azure region should be as an accepted location here. So let me put the condition. To check the condition, what there is one function which I can utilize, contains. So in Terraform we do have function which we are going to talk about. This contain function will check. If you just hit the contents, you can see contains determine whether a given list or set contains a given single value as one of its elements. So we can put the condition here that we can check with the help of the function contains that the value is correct or not, or the like validation is passing the value or not. So let me show you how we can do. So in the contents, the first thing we have to pass is the list dynamic. So dynamic list from where I wanted to check the list is or the correct value is passed or not. The first thing is the list, so I'll have to use the list, and then it's a location, so I'll use the West Europe as a one of the location, East US, West US, North Europe, and West US too. That is the first thing. Second, I wanted to check if the passing value of this variable is one of them or not. So the second thing is value, which you wanted to check from this list. So I have this accepted list. Only this value should be accepted, other value should not be. So I have passed my accepted value here, and now I have to define how it is going to check. So it is going to check with var.location. Okay. So in the validation block, the condition contains one of this location. So whenever we are passing the location value or defining the value of the location variable, it should be one of this. And contain function will make sure that it will check the passing value from this list. Okay, so that is the condition. The next thing is error message. If the condition is not satisfied, then you can write your own custom error message. So if someone is not providing one of this location, then you can, because it's a validation and let's assume they don't have the access to your code, so they don't know like which value is the correct value. So what you can do is in the error message, you can pass your own error message like not a valid location. Valid locations are, I can just simply copy this value here and just remove the comma from here, something like, or so I can write my own error message, and if we are not like assigning the value from one of this location, then the code is going to be fail and the error message will be there. So let's assume, let's have a look. So West Europe is part of the valid location. Instead of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some other location. So East US 2 is not part of this list. Let's assign the value as a default location, the East US 2, which is not part of my list. If I run the Terraform plan command, it will ask me the value for this. First key value address space is 192.168.0.0/24, and let me hit the enter. Now let's have a look if the location is the correct location or not. If it is not part of the correct location, then how the validation block will evaluate and will give you the error. So let's have a look. So when I run the Terraform plan, I have provided the value for the tags and the VNet address space. But in terms of the location, you can see it failed. Terraform encountered an error while generating this plan. Why? Invalid value for the variable, right? By default, east to west 2 is the correct location. But in our condition, it is not getting satisfied, right? It's not part of the one of the valid location. So you can see the Terraform code is failed, and the same error message which we have written by our own, a custom error message, not a valid location. Valid location are West Europe, East US, West US, North Europe, or West US. This was checked by the validation rule at the variable. So that is how we can use the validation of the variable. We can pass the condition, and if you're not sure how to pass the condition, then I would suggest to take the help from the chat GPT or any other tool to write the condition by your own, because there might be possibility you have to put some more complex condition. You might have to use the regex or something like that. So I always prefer to ask the chat GPT or any other tool to generate the condition if it is a complex condition. If it is just like few contains or something like that, then I can use or I can write my own. But if it is a regex or something like that, I'm not good with the regex, and I'm sure most of the people are not good writing the regex by their own, the regular expression. Then you can ask any of the chat gpt kind of a tool to generate the condition. But coming back to the location, it's not part of the one of the location. That's why the error message is there. So the validation rule failed, and with the help of the validation, I can put the some standardization of my variable. Only this value should be accepted, not other values or something like that. So that is the purpose of the validation. We already talked about the sensitive and the nullable. It's just like simple thing. Sensitive, you can put the sensitive if your variable has some sensitive value. So when you are running the Terraform plan or apply or something like that, then the output will not show the value of this particular variable, even if you are using the output block or if you are writing some other, like using in some other block. Nullable, if you wanted to use the null value for the variable, if you don't want like this value should not be null anytime, so you can have the nullable is equal to false, so nobody will be able to assign the null value for that particular variable. So that is the purpose of the nullable. We already talked about it. I'm not seeing any specific reason to like use here in our code. For now, the location, VNet address space, and map is the good example of declaring a variable. So this is how we are declaring a variable. So that's all about the variable declaration and the arguments available for the variable block. If you have any question, you can always put it into the comment. And in the next video, we are going to see how to define or assign the value of this variable. One of the way we already saw in the default, but there are more options available to assign the value of your variable. And then in the following video, we will see how to utilize it or how to use it in our main code. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Hi, welcome back. So far we have discussed about the variable declaration and the variable arguments. We had a look like how to declare the variable, how to write the variable block, and what kind of arguments we can use to perform a special task on those variable like validation, nullable, and all those. So far, we have seen how to declare the variable, but we didn't talk about how to define the value. We saw one of the example of default. We can use the default as a value of a variable, but we do have multiple ways to define the value. And based on our requirement, we can use whatever way we want. So like if I'm using the Terraform locally and I'm running the code from my laptop locally, then I can use some other way to define the value. But when I'm executing the code through the pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, then I can use some other way to define the value of the variable. So we can declare the variable in our Terraform configuration file, but defining the variable can be vary from way to way, like how we are executing the code. Based on that, we can define the value. So let's have a look what kind of a variable definition we do have, how we can define the variable, what type of definition we do have through which we can define the value of our variable which we have declared so far. So let's have a look. We do, as I have mentioned, we do have multiple ways. So to define the variable, we have a way to define value is default. We can also use -var, we can use .tfvars, we can use the environment variable, and we can also define the value at the runtime. So we'll start with the default, which we already have a look in our variable declaration section. But let's see how to define the value of the variable using default. So if I have a variable called location, I can use default is a default value of that variable. So we already talked about it. So what we could do is we can use default as an argument in our variable declaration, and we can provide the value whatever I want. So if someone is not assigning or defining the value of this location variable, then it will automatically take the default value. If you want to override this value, then you can use any other approach to define the value of the variable. The next one which we are going to talk about is -var. So let's assume I have defined or I have declared the variable called location. Now I wanted to define the value using the -var. What -var is doing, we can use the -var at the time of running the Terraform plan or apply. So at the time of executing the command, we can use the -var to define the value of our variable. Let's have a look how we could do that. So when I'm running the Terraform plan, I can use -var is equal to and my variable name. So in my case, it is location. Okay, so I have provided the location as a name, then equal to whatever the value I want. So the variable name and the variable value. So at the time of executing the Terraform plan or apply command, I can provide -var as a flag, and I can assign the value or define the value of my variable. So this is the second type of approach we can use to define the value of our variable. Then the another way we do have is, or before we are talking about the .tfvars, let's see if we have more than one variable, then how we are defining the value of two variable or more than two variables using this approach. So I can use the Terraform plan -var is equal to location, then the value, then again -var. That means I can use the -var flag multiple times with the Terraform plan and apply. And whatever the variables I do have, I can use this approach to define the value of those variable. But let's assume I have maybe 25 variables. Will it be a good approach to define the value doing the -var every time? Every time I have to put the Terraform plan, then -var 25 times, defining the value and assigning the value. It's not a good approach. Of course, it's not. And you can't. And another thing, you can't do that with the CI/CD pipeline as well. So to avoid these restrictions or to avoid this limitation, what we could do is we can use the .tfvars. But in some cases, we are using the -var when in the CI/CD pipeline we are taking the values from some other output which is not in the Terraform. So maybe a output of a PowerShell script, right? So that time I can use -var to demonstrate, like outside the Terraform, if we want a value from outside the Terraform, that time we can use this approach. But if we wanted to define the value in the Terraform configuration itself, then it's not a good approach, because every time you have to type like -var 25 times or maybe 10 times or 15 times, whatever the variables you have. So that is one of the approach. Then we do have another approach to define the variable called tfvars. And I already explained it into the, I believe in the Terraform syntax section. where I have explained there is a special extension file we do have in the Terraform, that is .tf So apart from .tf, we do have a special extension called .tfvars, and the file name should be the terraform.tfvars. It's a default file name for the Terraform definition, variable definition file. So whatever the variable you have, you can put the value in terraform.tfvars directly, so you don't have to define the value on the runtime or at the time of running the Terraform plan or apply command. So here I can use location is equal to West Europe. Simply. I don't have to mention anything. I don't even have to mention war.location. I can just simply use location is equal to and then the value of my variable. So if I'm using the terraform.tfvars, then it will be by default taking into the consideration. But if my file name is not the Terraform, then I can also use the prod.tfvars and the non-prod.tfvars in the cases where I want to execute same code on the prod environment and the non-prod. So in most of the cases, we want our production and the test environment should be similar. Just the naming convention and few specification of the virtual machine and other parts or other services, we may have a different value. So we can have the variables, we can have the same code and the same variable, but we can have the definition or the values of those variable in a different way. So for environment name, I'll have the prod. For environment name in the test, I'll have the test. For the virtual machine size for production, I might need a higher specification, so I can use that. For virtual machine size variable, I can have a different for the test environment. So I can have different values, but the code should be same. So in that case, what I can do is I can create two files called prod.tfvars and the non-prod.tfvars. Code will be same, variable declaration will be same, only the definition or the assignment of those variable value will be different, which I can put into the prod.tfvars and the non-prod.tfvars. But when I'm using a different name than the terraform.tfvars, I'll have to explicitly mention at the time of running the command. Okay. If it is a terraform.tfvars, if it is just for one environment, then I'm okay with putting my name as a terraform.tfvars. Then I don't have to provide it as a var file. But if file name is not terraform.tfvars, that time I'll have to use the terraform plan hyphen var hyphen file is equal to the file name. And this is in the PowerShell terminal. I can use this single inverted comma. And if it is a Linux or the command prompt, I'll have to use the double inverted comma to put the name of the file. So if you're not using the terraform.tfvars, or if you're using the same code for the multiple environment for the multiple variable file, and that is actually we are using in most of the cases in the production environment, just to keep the environment similar to environment in a similar way. So we can have maybe a prod and the DR is a similar environment, or the test and the prod is a similar environment, but I want a different configuration, different specification of the machine or something like that. So I can handle this thing on the variable level. Code will have the like virtual machine resource block will have the virtual machine size is a variable var.vm underscore size, and at the time of definition of that variable vm underscore size, in the test I'll use the d2s, but in the prod I'll use the d4s. So on the variable definition I can handle it. So this is how we are doing in the real environment as well. We can have the variable declaration, and then we can have the multiple tfr files to define the different value of the same terraform code. And based on the file which we are going to pass at the time of terraform plan and apply, the code will be executed. Okay, so this is how we configure the .tfvars. If it is terraform.tfvars, then you don't have to explicitly mention at the time of running the command terraform plan and apply. But if the name is not terraform.tfvars, then you have to mention with hyphen var hyphen file. Okay, so this is the third type of the definition of the variable. This is also one of the type where we can define through which we can define the value of our variable which we have declared so far. Okay, so the next one which we are going to talk about is the environment variable. With in Terraform variable, we can also assign the value with the environment variable. And I'm sure if you guys are learning the Terraform, then you know what is environment variable. Environment variable is a default type in both Windows and the Linux, where we can define the value of like a key value, a variable by default, and those environment variable we can use to define the value of a variable which we have declared in the Terraform. So environment variable is also help us to define the value, and that is one of the important one for CI/CD pipeline in the automation, where we wanted to configure the value or define the value of variable through the environment variable. So I can have the environment variable defined in through the PowerShell or some other automation, and Terraform will automatically taking into the consideration is the definition of the variable. But to define it through the environment variable, there are some special cases, because the environment variable, the name of the environment variable can be anything. But if I want my Terraform to consider those environment variable as a declared variable which I have configured in my configuration file. So let's assume I have a location. Now, how the Terraform or the Terraform execution or the CI/CD pipeline knows that this particular environment variable is the location for the Terraform. So we have a special type of a naming convention for the environment variable, which will be considered or taken into the consideration when running the code for our variable definition. So let's have a look. If you are using the PowerShell, then you'll have to define the environment variable with this command, $env colon, and then the special consideration is tf underscore var underscore. So this is the naming convention should be is in front of your variable name as a prefix. So if your environment variable start with tf underscore var underscore, the variable name. So my variable name is location. If my variable name, environment variable is tf underscore var underscore my variable name, and I have assigned the value is equal to West Europe, then this environment variable will be the definition of the location variable which I have declared. So I don't have to assign the value from any other way. I can just simply assign the environment variable called tf underscore var underscore whatever the variable I do have, and then I can assign the value and Terraform will taking into the consideration. If you're using the command prompt, then you can use the set command. If you're using the Linux, then you can use the export tf underscore var underscore location is equal to West Europe. So these are the type you can use, because based on your operating system, you can define the environment variable in a different way. But environment variable is one of the most useful variable definition which we are using when we are doing the automation, and we are running the code in the automation way with the CI/CD pipeline or something PowerShell script or something like that. So we can use the environment variable to define the value of variable which we have declared in our Terraform code. Okay. So apart from that, there is one more type of the variable definition is at runtime. Let's assume you didn't define the variable value with any of this approach, not default, no var, no tf vars, no environment variable. What would happen when you are running the Terraform plan code? I already explained that if you are not defining the value, then the code will be failed. It will not be failed, but first it will ask you at the time of running the Terraform plan or apply command that this variable you didn't define the value. Now you have to define it. So it's mandatory unless you have the default as an argument in your variable block. If you have the default argument, then it will take the default value. But if you don't have the default value, that means assigning the value is mandatory. It's required. So at the time of running the Terraform plan, it will ask you to assign the value. So at the runtime also, you can assign the value of your variable. So, or define the value of your variable at the runtime as well. So if you forget about it, then you can run it at the runtime as well. This is not a good practice. We are generally not using it with the CI/CD pipeline, because with the automation and the CI/CD pipeline, you don't get the prompt. It's automatically running. So you'll not get the prompt, and you'll not get the option to type anything on the prompt. But if you're running it locally, then you might use it for the debugging and the validation purpose. But I personally don't use it much. Most of the time, either we are configuring the default -var, TFR, or whatever we want, the other approach we do have. So that's all about the variable definition, and I hope you understand it. Uh, Now let's assume we have more than one definition, then how we are going to handle it. We are going to talk about this particular thing, the variable definition precedence, in the next section. So far, I have explained every way which we do have to define the variable. And in the next one, we are gonna talk about in a practical way how to define the variable. I hope you understand it. If you have any question, just put it into the comment. I'll try to answer it as soon as possible. And if you have any feedback, just put it into the comment. It will help me to improve myself, because I'm very new to YouTube. Thank you. Hi, so in this section, we talked about the variable definition. Variable definition is defining or assigning a value of your variable. In the variable declaration, we define the schema of the variable, like what would be the description of the variable, type of the variable, what would be the validation condition, what type of value this variable should accept or not, right? In the definition, we are passing the value of the variable or assigning a value to this particular variable before we are actually using it into the resource block or the data source. So when we are assigning the value in Terraform for the variable, we have multiple ways, which we already talked about. So we talked about the default -var.tf environment variable at runtime. Default we already saw. When you are assigning a value of a variable using default option, that means now your variable is the optional input. And when I say the optional input, that means if you are passing the value of this variable again, then it will be override to the default. Otherwise, if you are not providing any value for this location variable, then the default value will be taken into the consideration. So West Europe will be your default location. And if you want to override this value, you can pass it in any other way. You can pass it through the -var or the .tf But if you're not passing, then the default value will be there. Now let's assume you have a variable without the default option. Then without passing the value of this variable, you will not be able to run the Terraform plan or apply command. At the time of running the Terraform plan, if you have noticed in the last session of the variable declaration, that when we are running the Terraform plan and if the value is not assigned with the default option, then at the time of the runtime, it was asking to provide the value of the VNet address space, for an example, or the tags. So we can also assign the value at the time of the runtime, which we already saw, but I will show you again. So default is you can put the value for your variable is a default and you can assign the value for that, right? It's the one way of the assignment of the value. The another option is -var. So let's assume if I wanted to provide the value of the tag with the help of the -var option, what I can do is at the time of running the Terraform plan command, I can pass the -var is equal to the name of the variable, that is tags in my case, is equal to the value of the tags in inverted comma. So I know tag is map and map is always defined in a curly braces. So I'll pass the curly braces, then the key. Key you can pass whatever the key you want. So let's assume I want a key, maybe a deployment date, which we are already using, but let's assume I wanted to put some fixed value of the deployment date. So I can use the deployment date and then colon and then space the date of the deployment. So let's assume it's 06092025. Okay, so I have passed this value and then I can just simply run the Terraform plan command. What would happen if I run the Terraform plan command? So at the time of running the Terraform plan command, now it will ask me to provide the value of the VNet test address space because I already defined the value of the location at the default and tag it with the help of the -var, but I didn't define the value for the VNet address. So when you're not defining the value of the variable in any other way, then at the time of running the command, Terraform will ask you to provide the value. That is at runtime. This type of assignment or this type of variable definition, we call it runtime. So for VNet test address space, what I can do, it's a list. So I'm going to use the square braces and then the value of the variable /24 and something like this. So now I have three examples of the definition: default, -var for the text, default for the location, and at the runtime for the VNet test address space. So let's run the Terraform plan command. And we shouldn't get any error. That means the definition or the assignment of the value is correct. If we are getting any error, then we can see like the definition was not correct. I am not passing any specific or correct value. But now there is no changes in infrastructure, no error, nothing. That means the definition is correct. But still, if you want to make sure like the value I am assigning for the variable is correct, what we could do is we can create a file called output.tf and we can use the or we can get the help of the output block. So let's assume I wanted to make sure that the location is correct. So what I can do is in the output, I can pass the value of var.location. That is the example of the usage, but we are going to talk about in a detailed way in next section for that. And then we do have test vnet address space. I just wanted to make sure like my value is correctly assigned. So I'm going to use the output block for that purpose, and then for the tags we do have war dot tags. Now what will happen if I run the Terraform plan command again with the same way and passing the value here 192.168.0.0/24, then now I'll get the output in the Terraform plan and the Terraform apply as well, because I'm using the Terraform output block, and we already talked about it, like what is the purpose of the output block and how we can utilize it. So now let's have a look. We have assigned three values. The location should be West Europe in the output. So the location is West Europe. The tag deployment date is what I have passed here with the hyphen var, and test vnet address is what I have passed at a runtime. So this is how we can define the value of the variable. These are the three way. Now let's talk about the another two, which is very important. So .tfvars is one of the very important way of defining the value. But before we are talking about the environment variable in the .tfvars, the question comes in the mind. If I would be on your place and if someone is explaining it to me, my first question would be how we are deciding, like what is the which way I'm going to use to define the value of my variable. How we are deciding? Should I go with the runtime? Should I go with the hyphen var? Should I go with the default? Should I go with the .tfvars or the environment variable? So the answer to this question is depends on the environment. Like I am doing it manually on my machine. I'm running the Terraform command. My personal way would be the .tfvars, because I can manage the assignment, all the values definition in a one single .tfvars file. Okay, but now let's assume we are doing it on the pipeline way, CI/CD pipeline way, on in an automated way. So when I'm running the CI/CD pipeline, I don't get the prompt to provide the values, right? Then the at runtime will not work for me, because if I'm not assigning the value to the variable, then the prompt will just freeze and expect me to provide the value of the variable at runtime. So let's assume I do have a code where I do have the variable, but I forget to define the value of the variable and I just ran the pipeline. It happens a lot with me when in the real time environment when I'm working on a CI/CD pipeline, that sometimes I forget to assign the value of the variable. And when I'm running the Terraform command, it just gets stopped on the runtime, because without providing the value, you can't run the Terraform plan or apply if the variable is not defined in any other way, right? Like what we did last time, we run the Terraform plan command and it was asking me to provide the value. So the same thing happened in my CI/CD pipeline as well. It was waiting for me to provide the value, but I don't get the prompt, or I don't get the interaction window where I can pass the value, because it's automated pipeline. It's automatically running. Okay, so at runtime, for sure, we can't use with the pipeline. Now, default is we can always use to put the default value for the optional input argument, like location. I want to keep West Europe as a default. If someone is not explicitly providing the value of the location variable, then the West Europe will be the default value. These two things I understand. Hyphen var in the CI/CD pipeline, we are using sometime hyphen var, we are not using. When we are using, if let's assume we do have a CI/CD pipeline with some stages, and before running the Terraform command or Terraform plan or apply, I am generating a value of a variable in some other automated way, like maybe using some PowerShell script, Python, getting it as an input or something like that. So that time what I can do is I can pass the value in my CI/CD pipeline with the hyphen var option from the external sources, right? So that time I can use hyphen var to provide the value of the variable from the external sources, from some other PowerShell script or something like that. So that is how we are using the hyphen var. If I'm talking about the .tf vars, if you wanted to keep or centralizedly manage all the definition of your variable from from a specific file, then you can use the .tf vars. In your CI/CD pipeline, you don't want to take it as an input from the external source, or if you want to take for two variables but not for the other three variables, then you define the three variables from .tf vars and two variables at the hyphen var option. So that is also you can do. So if you wanted to keep fixed and centralizedly manage your variable definition, then you can use the .tfvars. The another option is the environment variable. That is also very important with the CI/CD pipeline and all. So let's assume there is a secret value, there is a some password or something like that, and you wanted to define it as a secured variable. Then what you can do is you can define the environment variable level. So like in my environment, I do have a GitLab pipeline, and if I wanted to pass the value of my like virtual machine password or something like that, what I'm doing is I can pass it on my GitLab project level as a environment variable, and then the value will be passed through it. So there are few ways, like when you're actually going to work or in a real-time environment with the Terraform, you will get to know like which one is the best way. So you can define your own way how you're going to use it, which will be more feasible, more secured way to provide the value of the variable. So based on this discussion, we can decide how we are going to assign or define the value of the variable. So let's talk about the .tf now. So we have defined the value of the tag in the last section with the hyphen word. Now let's have a look. So as I have explained, .tf is there are two ways. First thing, if you don't want to pass the file name explicitly every time when you are running the Terraform plan or the apply command, then you can use the default name of the file, that is terraform.tfvars. So you'll create a file called terraform.tfvars, and then in the terraform.tfvars, you assign the value of your variable. And to assign it, what you could do is you can just copy the name of the variable. And let's assume I am going to use east-west. So I can use the east-west here. The next one is vnet address. So I can just simply take the list of the vnet address here, maybe something like this. And then the last one is the tags. So I wanted to use the tag. So maybe I can use environment is equal to test or something like that. Sensitivity is equal to high or something like that. Now we already have the output block, so this is also going to be output when we are running the Terraform plan command. So variables.tf, we do have default for West Europe, address and tag. And in the terraform.tf vars, I have defined the new values. And now let's run the Terraform plan command. So far, when we were executing the Terraform plan command, it was asking me to provide the value of the variable because I didn't define to anywhere. Now I have defined the value in the terraform.tf vars. Let's run the Terraform plan command. Technically, it should not ask me to provide the value of the variable now, right? Because I already defined it into the terraform.tfr. So that is the one of the way and one of the most useful way, I would say, because most of the time you are using the terraform.tfrs. And you can see the location is east US now because it is overwriting the value of the default, and tag is there, the environment test, sensitivity high, and the test virtual network address. Now let's assume if the file name is not terraform.tfrs and instead of that is test.tfrs, what would happen? Let me run the Terraform plan command again. Now it is asking me for the tagging value. That means it is not automatically detecting. So Terraform will detect the tfvars variable assignment only if the file name is the terraform.tfvars. And if you don't have the file name terraform.tfvars, then you have to pass the file name here explicitly when running the Terraform plan command with terraform plan -var -file is equal to the name of your file, that is terraform.tfvars, and run the command. Now it will take the variable assignment into the considerations. So if the file name is not terraform.tfvars but some other tfvars, then you have to explicitly provide the name of your file. So now it is working. So that is how we can utilize the tfvars to assign the value. Now let's check the last one. I'm gonna delete this tfvar file and I'm gonna assign the tag on an environment variable level. So I'm using the PowerShell. So in the PowerShell, to define the environment variable, you have to use $sign environment and the name of the environment variable. To assign the value of the environment variable, what we have to do is we have to follow a specific naming convention of your environment variable. So in my case, the specific naming convention is tf underscore var underscore the name of the tag or variable. So it's tags. Now is equal to, I want the value of this particular environment variable. Let's assume I am taking same deployment date 25/6/2025, something like this, and assigning the variable. Now this variable has been defined, and there are multiple ways to define the environment variable based on your uh, command line interface. So I'm using PowerShell. So in PowerShell, if you want to define the variable, system variable, environment variable, then you're using this format. But if you're using command line, then it will be different. If you're using Linux, then it will be different. But the format of the environment variable name should always be like this: tf underscore var and the name of your variable. That should be the format, and then the value you wanted to assign. Now let me run the Terraform run command. It will ask me to for the vnet test address because I didn't define the vnet test address so far. So let me assign it, and then I'll just hit the enter. So now it is not asking me for the tag. I don't have the tf vars. I don't have the default value. I didn't pass it with the Terraform plan hyphen var option. That means nowhere the tagging value is defined. Only the environment value or environment variable with the specific format is there, and I can see the value 2506/2025, which is here. So this is how you are defining a value of your variable with the help of the environment variable. So we talked about the default way of assigning the value. We talked about the hyphen var. We talked about the .tfvars in both way, Terraform .tfvars, or if the name is customizable name or different name, then you have to pass that var.file name, and then environment variable we just saw, and then at the runtime we already saw it. Like if you are not assigning in any way, then when you are running the Terraform plan command, it will prompt you to pass the value. So which you can do that, which we just did here in for the vnet test address. So that's all about the variable definition part, like how you can define the variable. In next section, we are going to talk about if I am defining the value of one variable in a multiple ways with the environment variable, with default, with hyphen var and the tf vars, then how it works. How which value will be taken into the consideration, which value will be the precedence to compare to the other assignment. So in the next section, we are going to talk about it, and then in the laboratory section, I'm going to show you assigning the value of one variable in a multiple ways and then which one will be precedence. So that's all about the variable definition. Hope you enjoyed this session, and if you have any question you can put it into the comment and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Hi, welcome back. So in our last section we discussed about the variable definition. There were multiple types of variable definition we do have to define the value or assign the value of the variable. In this section, we are going to talk about variable definition precedence if we are using the multiple ways. So let's assume we have the variable definition in the default, but at the same time, we do have the variable definition in the environment variable type as well. Or maybe I do have like a Terraform TFR files for that. Which one will be considered into the first, and which one will be overwritten? So let's have a look. So as we have discussed, we do have multiple ways in the variable definition. We do have default, hyphen var, tfvars, environment variable, and at the runtime. So let's see what is the variable definition precedence is. So the first one is the default, as I have mentioned before, that you can define the default value of the variable and it will be overwritten unless we are defining it into the any other way or not. So if I have a definition in some other way, then this will be overwrite whatever the value I am defining into the default will be overwritten with any other way. So that one has the least precedence or least priority, I would say, when the definition comes into the picture. Next one is the environment variable. So if you have the default value of the variable and at the same time you have the environment variable as well. So the one which we have the value of variable we have in the environment variable. So let's assume default I have West Europe, but in the environment variable I have UK South. So the variable of the actual execution will be happening on the environment variable level. So the location will be the UK South, not the West Europe. Similarly, if I do have the .tf vars, it will be precedent to all of the others like default and the environment variable. So if I have defined the value in the .tfvars files, then that will be taking into the consideration, and all the default and the environment variable will be overwritten. So the tfvars will be taking into the consideration. If I talk about the Terraform tfvars, because we do have Terraform tfvars, so we can also have the name of the file. So the first one will be considered into the Terraform.tfvars, and the above Terraform TFVars, there will be a Terraform TFVars.json. So we can also have the Terraform.tfvars.json if you wanted to assign the value in a JSON format. So the JSON will be preceded over the Terraform.tfvars. So if you have defined into the default environment variable Terraform.tfvars and then the Terraform TFVars.json, then the value which we have defined in .json will be taken into the consideration. Then we do have star.auto.tfvars or star.auto.tfvars.json. So it will have the high priority or high precedent compared to any other TFVars. So If we have tfvars.json, and we do have auto.tfvars or auto.tfvars.json, then that will be comes into the picture, and that will be considered, because at name implies auto.tfvars.json is basically most of the time are using into the automation. So if we do have auto.tfvars, the file name with the extension, then that will be taking into the consideration. Then we do have -var, that is something with the highest priority. So if I have the value defined in the default environment variable or any other way, if I am configuring it at the time of executing the command with -var, then that will be considered, and that will be taking into the consideration. And with the var, we do have -var and the -var -file. So at the time of defining -var, and the -var dot -file will be taking into the consideration. So if we have the file prod.tfvars, and we do have the terraform.tfvars as well, but at the time of running the Terraform plan, I am explicitly mentioned prod.tfvars, then prod.tfvars will be taking into the consideration, not the terraform.tfvars. If I am not explicitly mentioned, then by default terraform.tfvars will be taking into the consideration. So these are the variable definition precedents we do have, and it will be first from default, then environment variable will override the default. Terraform.tfvars will override the environment variable and the default. Terraform.tfvars.json will override default environment variable terraform.tfvars, and star.auto will override all of the above. And the last one is, or the highest priority will be -var and -var-file will be taking into the consideration, and will override every other value which we have defined in other way. So that's what we do have is a variable definition precedence in Terraform. So that's all about the variable definition precedence. So now let's have a look in a lab and practical way of the variable definition precedence. We already talked about what would be the sequence, how the variable definition precedence are going to work, and which one will override which one. But let's have a look into the practical way in a real time how it works. Hey, so in this section we talked about the variable definition precedence. Like if I am assigning a value for a specific variable multiple times in a different way, then which one will be taken into the consideration, or which one will be actually applied in my Terraform plan or the Terraform apply command. So we already talked about it. Like the first one would be the default. So if there is no variable definition on any other way, then the variable default will be taking into the consideration. It will be proceed to anything else because we don't have any assignment. And that is what making your variable a optional argument or a optional input. So if someone is not providing it all, then the default will be considered. That is the first thing. Now, if I'm assigning a value for the environment variable or variable with the environment variable, so how it works. So let's have a look. We already talked about it, like how to define it, but let me show you. TF underscore var location is defined with the West Europe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign the location again with the environment variable, and this time the value would be East US. So default is West Europe, but in the environment variable, the value of the location would be the East US. So I have assigned this environment variable. Now let's run the Terraform plan command, and then we'll see how it will work. So it will ask me at the runtime because I don't have the value for the test address space. So let me do it, and then we'll see. Okay, so now we can see the value of the location is East US. So default was West Europe, environment variable was configured with the East US, so the value is East US. So as I have mentioned that environment variable will proceed to the default, which it is doing. Now let's assume I'm doing the same assignment of value of location in the terraform.tfvars as well. So let me create a file called terraform.tfvars and assigning the location variable here. Let's take in one of the allowed value, that is West US, and then I'm going to assign it. Now the location assignment is on three ways. Default I do have, environment variable I do have, and now I'm assigning on the TF as well. So let's see which one will be taking into the consideration. And also what I'm going to do is vnet test address space is also I'm going to configure, so I don't have to pass it at the runtime again. So I've assigned it with the TF itself. So now let's run the Terraform plan command. And then we'll have a look which location will be taken into the consideration or will be considered. We have West Europe on a default, we have East US on an environment variable, and now we do have West US on a location with the TF So I can see the Terraform.tf is proceed to environment variable in the default. Now let's take the another example, that is terraform.tf.json. So we can also define the value with the help in the JSON format as well with the Terraform. So this is one of the very good thing of the Terraform is like you can assign the value with the JSON format as well. Like if you are using some automation tool, some Power Automate, Power Automate, which is generating the output in a JSON format, and you want to take that output as an input of your Terraform, that is also you can do. So let me create a file called terraform.tf.json, and in the JSON we do have different way to assign the value. So the value here is the location variable is location, and let me take the next one, North Europe, and then I'm gonna assign it. Let's clear and run the Terraform plan again. So now the value of the location should be North Europe. So the TF is not going to be considered the terraform.tf and instead of that terraform.tf.json will be taking into the consideration, and I can see that. So the terraform.tf.json will proceed to the terraform.tf, and the next one is the auto. If you have star.auto something like that, then it will proceed. And after that, let's assume I wanted to proceed anything above that, like if the value in the TF and everywhere, if the value is wherever it is, but I just don't want to consider any of this value. Instead of that, I would prefer to have my own value with the hyphen var, and then I'll put the location, and I'll take the next location, that is West US 2 as an example, and run the Terraform plan command. So technically the location should be the West US 2 now. So if I'm using the hyphen var or hyphen var hyphen file, like if the terraform.tf is not the .tf is not a terraform.tf, instead of that some custom name, then that value should be or will be considered. So now Terraform plan, if I am running with hyphen var, then all the other values will be invalid for that variable, and only the value which I am passing explicitly at the time of running the Terraform plan command will be considered. So that is actually a good option. Like if you wanted to pass a value explicitly on the Terraform plan when you're running the CI/CD pipeline, then you're generating it as an output from an external source and passing it as a variable when you're running the Terraform plan command with hyphen var, then this value should overwrite all the other values. Okay, so if the value is assigned on an environment variable level, tfvars.json, or like by default, all these values should not be considered, should be invalid, and should be override with the value which I am passing with the Terraform plan command explicitly. Okay, so this is how you can identify like which value will proceed to the way of assignment. So if default is there, then it will be proceed with the environment variable will precede the default. If you are assigning, then the terraform.tf tfvars.json, then auto, and then finally on the top priority it will be explicitly when running the Terraform plan command with hyphen var option or hyphen var hyphen file option. So this is how the definition precedence works in the Terraform. So when you are actually in a real-time environment, you are going to do it. You are using the CI/CD pipeline. You are using another way as well. That time you can decide like which way would be better for you to assign the value of your variable. For now, in our case, we are going to use the terraform.tfs file. It's simple. And if you are not using the CI/CD pipeline and all, and you wanted to centralizely manage that your assignment and just wanted to keep it simple, then use the terraform.tfs, which we are going to use for now in our project. So I'm going to assign all the values here. So the West Europe would be my location, and VNet test address will be here. Maybe I'll have to use the 170.18.00.24, and then tags. I'll use the environment is equal to test, sensitivity is equal to high, something like that. and then I remove all the environment variable and everything, and only this terraform.tf files will be considered. So this is how we can assign the value of the variable or define the value of the variable and how the definition precedence works in the Terraform. So hope you enjoyed this session. If you have any question, you can always put it into the comment, and we are going to talk about the variable usage. So we have defined the variable so far. Now we are going to use it into our resource block and the data source block in the main.tf file in our code. So let's have a look in the next session, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so now we are going to discuss about the variable usage. So far we have seen variable declaration, variable definition, variable arguments. And as I have mentioned in the very first session of the variable, that the approach we do have in the Terraform for the variable is first we declare the variable, then we set some arguments if we want to, if we wanted to put some condition, otherwise it's optional. Then we define the value of the variable, and then we are using the variable in resource block or data source block. So let's have a look how we can use the variable. So far we have defined them, we have declared them, but we didn't use it as so far. So let's have a look how to use the variable which we have defined. To use the variable, it's very simple. It's not like a rocket science, I would say. Let's assume I have defined a variable called location, declared a variable called location, and I have assigned the value of the location is the west 0. Now I wanted to use this variable. How I'm gonna use? So I do have a resource block called Azure RM resource group rg-nw for new or network, and then name of the resource group is rg-network, and the location is the west 0. If I'm creating this resource block, then either I can put the name of the resource group and the location of the resource group in a plain text, or I can use the location. And I have already explained why we are using the variable. So by using the variable, you can dynamically assign the value, right? You can have the value and you can have the single source of truth. Whenever you wanted to change, you can just change the value of the variable, location variable, definition of the location variable. If you want to change it from the West Europe to UK South or East US or something like that, you can just change it over there. You don't have to touch your Terraform configuration code again and again, right? So that is the purpose of the variable. And when you are going to work on the Terraform, you always know like how important the variable is. I never write a code without using the variable. Never ever. Always we are using the variable just to make sure our code is dynamically changeable. We can change it and we have a single source of truth on the variable level. So we can define the value of the variable either through the pipeline, in the environment variable, in TFRs, or many more way. So let's have a look how we use it. We have defined or we have declared a variable called location. Then we have defined a variable called West Europe, and I wanted to replace my location here from plain text to the variable. So what I'll have to do is first I'll remove this, and then I'll use the var.location. That's it. That's it. That's how we use the variable. You just have to use it as a var.location, but make sure you are putting var.location. If you remember in the terraform.tf was, when we are defining the value, we don't have to put the var.location. We just have to define the value location is equal to the name of the location. But when we are using it, we have to put var dot the name of the variable. So the name of the variable was location. So we are using var.location. Now let's execute the code. I'm running the Terraform plan, and if you can see, it has automatically taken the West Europe because I have defined it into the variable, and the variable is coming into the resource block. So that is how we use the variable. So now we have defined the variable, we declared the variable, we use the variable. Let's assume I wanted to append some value, some prefix or something else with the variable. Then how I'm gonna handle it? So there is a way to use with a variable called interpolation, and that is again most important part of the variable. So I'll explain why we are using the interpolation and how we are using the interpolation. Interpolation is basically using or modifying the value of your variable. So if I wanted to use two variable together, or if I wanted to use some string with the variable, I wanted to append it with some string, some prefix or suffix, then how I'm going to handle it. So to use the interpolation, what we do is, let's assume I do have a variable called network resource group, and it will be in a string. And now let's see what is the value of this, or what's the value we are defining is the name of the resource group is network. Okay, then I'm using it into the resource group, right? But what I want is I want my network resource group should always come up with the rg-network. So whatever the name I'm using, it should be prefixed with the rg. So I can use the var.name here, the network resource group name here, but I wanted to append it with some additional string. And what I'm saying, why I'm saying this or why I'm doing is because I wanted to follow a proper naming convention. And I'm sure if you guys are working in a production environment, you know what is the benefit and how important to follow the naming convention is, right? So even we do have the documentation in Azure itself to follow the standard naming convention and what are the standard naming convention Microsoft recommended us. So it's always important to follow the naming convention. So if I wanted to follow the naming convention and I wanted to make sure whatever the resource group I'm creating, you should prefix with the RG. But the name of the variable or the definition of the variable does have only the network. Then how I'm gonna handle it? So let's assume I have defined the value var.network resource group name. Then what would happen? It will have the name is network, but I want a RG in a prefix. So how I'm gonna prefix RG or I'm gonna use this string as an additional of the variable, and that is very important because we are doing it into the production. We are always using a combination of the variable. We are always using some string with the variable. So how we are gonna do it? That is what we are gonna discuss here. Interpolation is helping us to combine two values of the variable or some string or some additional characters if you wanted to add. And it's not just about the character, but whatever you wanted to add. So let's assume we have the name of the variable is like definition of the variable is network and I want RG in front of it. What I'll do is I'll just move the var.network resource group and then this is what I'll have to add inverted comma, the string which I want because it's a string so it should be in an inverted comma, RG hyphen, and when I'm putting this value, I'm using the variable here. I'll have to make sure if I am interpolating, if I am merging it with some other values or some other variable, then I have to put the variable in dollar curly braces close, and then the inverted comma. This is how you are defining an interpolation or you are merging the variable value. This is what we called interpolation in terms of the Terraform. And that is very important because when you are defining the naming convention, let's assume I want my resource group name should be consisting with the RG hyphen environment name, hyphen client name, hyphen the type of the resource or the role of the resource, and then hyphen 001 002 something like that. So we are going to take the input as a environment. We are going to client name as a input of the variable as a one separate variable. We'll take the environment as a separate variable. We'll take the type or role as a separate variable, and then we'll have to merge them together. So with the help of the interpolation only, we can merge them together and we can have the single name, single source of the name where we can have the proper naming convention. So let's see the Terraform, what would be the output of the Terraform plan. And now if you see, it's RG hyphen network because the network we already defined in the variable and RG we have put it into the as a prefix with the help of the interpolation. Okay, so now let's have a look how we combine more than one variable with the help of the interpolation. So let's assume I do have a variable called network resource group name as we have configured before. And on top of that, now I do have one more variable called environment. So in the environment, I'll configure the environment name, maybe prod test or whatever I want. Okay. And I would like to make sure that whenever I'm configuring the resource group name, this environment plus the network resource group name, they should be combined together. And on top of that, I should have the prefix called RG to represent it's a resource group. Okay. So let's have a look how we can combine more than one variable with the help of the interpolation. So in the terraform.tfs, I have configured the network resource group name is equal to network and environment name is equal to test. Let's see how we have configured the RG-network in our previous session. Now let's have a look how I can combine more than one variable and if I wanted to use environment in between the RG and the network. So what I'll have to do is I'll have to just move the network resource group name a little bit on the right side, and then I can use the same way which I have used with the interpolation before. I can use the dollar sign, curly braces, and inside the curly braces, I can use var.environment, and then I can put the hyphen and then dollar sign, and in the curly braces, I can put the network resource group name. And now if I run the Terraform plan, then the name of the resource group will be the rg-test-network. So this is how we can combine more than one variable. This is how we can combine the variable value with some string or some additional prefix or suffixes if you want. And most of the time we are using this interpolation when we are defining a proper naming convention of our resources. And we are doing it in mostly in the modules. And when we are calling the module, we are just configured input is a client name, environment and all. And in the module, we have defined the interpolation and the name of the resources, and they are combining together to define a proper naming convention of the resource. And this is something we will have a look in the module, why we are using the module and what is the purpose of the module. But interpolation is again to combine more than one variable value, or if we are combining it with some prefix, some hyphen, something like that to define a proper naming convention, and then we are using the interpolation. Interpolation is nothing but you have to use the variable value with the dollar sign and the curly braces, and inside that you can put the variable called var.environment and whatever the variable name you are preferring or you have. So that's all about the variable usage and variable interpolation. In the next section, we are going to talk about the local variable. So let's have a look to the local variable. And before we are going into the local variable, let me just give you a brief like what is the local variable and how it is different from the normal variable. So in variable, we have a look. We can define the variable, we can declare the variable, can use the arguments, and then we can define the value of the variable. Local variable is not like the normal variable, it's a different one. You don't have to declare the variable in local variable. You don't have to define the type. With the help of local variable, you can directly assign the value of your variable. And why we are using it? When we do have the variable, then why do we need the local variable? So let's have a look. Why do we need the local variable before we are talking about a local variable more? Let's have a look. So let's assume I do have the same scenario again. I do have a resource group name, and then I do have the environment type, and I have the resource group prefix is a rg-environment, and the network name is going to be network resource group. And if I'm creating the virtual machine, then I might have the resource group called compute or something like that. But this resource group prefix will always be there. It will always be there. The rg-test will always be there with all the resource group if I'm creating more than one resource group. The name of the resource group will keep changing. It might be network, firewall, it will be compute, storage or something like that, but the prefix should always be there. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure every time I'm using the rg-environment, it should be assigned to a new variable called resource group prefix or something like that. So I don't have to type the rg-environment always. So let's see if I can do that. So what I can try to do is I can define it as a resource group or declare it as a resource group variable, and then I can define the value in the terraform.tfvars rg-environment. But that is something you can't do. So that means in the variable or in the normal variables, you can't refer the another variable. So if I have a variable called resource group prefix and I wanted to combine RG with environment variable and I wanted to assign the value of this two combination to another variable, I can't do that. I can refer one variable into the value of another variable. And that time we are using the local variable. Also the local variable we are using to do the interpolate to multiple variables where we don't have to like use one value of the variable into the another one because we can't use it in the Terraform, and we are using the local variable to define a proper naming convention, and then we can keep using this local variable. And also the local variable is defined on the Terraform itself, and we don't have in the declaration and in a Terraform configuration itself. So we don't have any way to define the value of the local variable from some outsources. We are mostly using the local variable to interpolate the different variables value, and we are using it for different kind of a complex naming convention if we wanted to use, or different kind of a complex calculation, or different kind of a complex thing task which we wanted to perform on a variable or any other values, and we wanted to refer this value into the another resource group. So we are using the local variable over there. And local variable is something specific for the Terraform configuration code. We can't define it with the -var. We can't define it with the environment variable. It will be just used inside the Terraform configuration code itself. It will be used as a locally it will be used. So you can't define the value of the local variable through some outside sources or something like that. Most of the time we are using the local variable to do the complex task or perform the complex task or the interpolation. And if I wanted to perform some like a function like maybe contents or something like that, merging two values, or if I'm merging two map values or something like that, if I'm converting map into the list, or if I wanted to pick a specific value from the list, so I can do this thing with the help of the local variable, because you can't define or you can't use one variable inside the another variable. What I'm trying to do right now, it is not possible. So in that case, what I'll have to do is I'll have to use the local variable. Again, not necessarily you have a separate file for the locals, but good to have. So if we have any local reference like local variable reference, then I know where the local variable has been defined, not declared, because we can't declare the local variable and we don't have to declare. We can directly define it. So let's have a look how we write the local variable. Again, similar to any other block in the Terraform, local does have its own block, but this block doesn't have any name, doesn't have any provider resource type or anything like which we do have in the resource block or the variable. It's just simple block. It is start with the locals and open curly braces and then the close curly braces. This is how we write the local block. And now whatever the argument and value we are going to put into inside this block will be our local variable name and value. So let's have a look. I wanted to create a resource group prefix, and it should be rg-var.environment. And that is something I can use in the local variable. This is something I can't use into the normal variable, but that is something I can use into the local variable. So if you see, the local variable name will be your argument and value will be your local variable value. So in local variable, it's quite different than our normal variable and normal block as well in the Terraform. You just have to define the locals, start the local curly braces, close it, and whatever the value, key value pair you are going to put, argument and argument value you are going to put into this block will be considered as your local variable. Now we have defined the local variable, we assigned the value. Now let's have a look how we can use this local variable in our Terraform configuration code. So again, we wanted to replace rg-var.environment with the resource group prefix. So we can just simply remove it. And instead of that, what we could do is we can use in the same interpolation way local dot resource group prefix. So local variable represent, whenever we are referring it, it will be local dot resource group prefix, and the normal variable will be the var dot network resource group name. And if you can see on the Terraform plan output, the new name is rg-test-network. So with the help of local variable, we can perform complex tasks on our variable values, and whatever the output we are getting from the resource group block and the data sources, we can combine them. We can perform like maybe use some functions to change the values. Maybe we can use some for loop to define the values. We can merge the different values. We can pick something from the map variable, we can pick something from the list variable, and we can do different tasks with the help of the local variable. So we have discussed about the variable usage, interpolation, and the local variable. Now let's have a look in a practical way where we are using it, how we are using it, and I'll try to explain what we could do with variable usage in the local variable, and how we are using the variable interpolation to make sure we are following a proper naming convention, or we are defining a proper naming convention. So let's have a look in a practical way. Thank you. So in this section, we talked about the variable usage. We already discussed about the variable declaration, where we define the schema of the variable, type of the variable, and every other property of the variable. Then in the next stage, we talked about the variable definition and how to assign the value to the variable. And now the last stage of the variable is to utilize it or to use the variable. So how we are using the variable in the code. So let's go to our main.tf file. The purpose of the location was to replace this value with the variabilization value, with the variable, right? So here I'm going to use the variable location, the location variable which we are assigning in the terraform.tfr file. So the value of the location is West Europe, And here also I'm using the West Europe, or I already deployed these resources with the West Europe. So if I'm going to replace or use the variable, how I can do is I'll have to use the var representing the variable dot the name of the variable. That's it. This is how simple to utilizing the variable. It's not that tricky as declaring or defining the value of the variable. Utilizing is very simple. You can just simply put the var dot the location, the name of the variable. So in my case, it's a location. So I'm using the var dot location. I'm going to replace the same thing here and then here. Okay. The location value was West Europe before doing the variabilization, and now also it is West Europe. But now I'm managing it on a centralized way. If I wanted to change the location, I can just simply change the location here in the terraform.tfy file or any other way of the assignment definition of the variable. But for now, let's talk about the tfvars itself. So I can just simply change the value here. I already deployed these resources to the West Europe. And if I'm going to run the Terraform plan command now, there will not be any changes. It will be just no infrastructure changes at this moment, right? But if I change the value of this location with the East US, okay, and this East US is one of the valid value based on the declaration or based on the schema of the variable. East US is the valid value, so that is correct. Now if I'm going to run the Terraform plan command, what would happen? Now Terraform will try to replace all the resources, because if resource, we can't change the value of the resource group or location of the resource group, not from even the portal or any other way. It's a fixed value. So if I'm trying to change the value of the location, then Terraform will try to destroy all the resources and recreate it into the new location, because they were already created in the West Europe, and now I'm trying to change the value of the West Europe. So I have changed the value of this. That means the resource group hub will be destroyed from the West Europe and recreated in the East US. So these three values, I understand, like they are going to be replaced. What about the other four resources? So other four resources are taking the resource group location into the consideration, because we are referring them. They do have the implicit dependency on the resource group location. So they are also going to be replaced, because these resources, the network security group or the virtual network, were also created in the West Europe. And now they will try to create in a East US because I changed the location. So this is how we can utilize the variable. Now, the next one, which we discussed in our last session, the variable interpolation. What is variable interpolation? So when we are using the variable, if it is a location, we can simply use it. But now what I wanted to do is, I'm gonna clear this window, change the location back to West Europe. I just wanted to show you, and that's why I replaced the location and just wanted to show you the impact of the location. So, or variable changing into one part of the code, and it will just impact the whole code, because we are doing the variabilization, and now the source of truth is this file. Whatever the location variable you are going to pass here will be impact all the resources in your code. So that is the power of the variable. Okay. Now let's have a look to the variable interpolation. So as I have mentioned before, that I am trying to do the variabilization of whatever possible. So I just wanted to do the variabilization of the name of the resource group as well. So let's have a look what we could do here. Now, first I'll have to see how my resource group name is constructed. So the first thing is the resource name. So it's a resource group. That's why I'm using the RG, which we already have in our resource inventory here. That resource type. Then we do have the application. Then we do have the environment. We do have the region, in which region we are deploying, and then the number of or instance of the resource. So that is how I'm constructing my name of the resource group. Now, what I wanted to do, instead of passing this value here, and every time if I'm introducing a new resource like a network security group or the resource group, virtual network, and I have to deploy a lot more resources now, it will be very difficult for me to like manage all this naming convention and all. And let's assume we are changing the location, then the location here the short form of the location should also be replaced, right? If I'm using the east US, then this should also be replaced. For location, I have just three places where I have to replace the location, which I can manage easily with the variable. But the naming convention is far more than the location. Everywhere I'm using the location short form in the naming convention, and going forward also for all the resources, I'm going to do that. Now, how I can replace it, or how I can do the variabilization of this part? If I can do the variabilization, that means I can also manage it centralized on a centralized level from the TFVAS file itself. So if I'm changing the location here, I can also change the value of that short form of the location. So now first let's define a variable or declare a variable for this short form of the location, and I'll just put the name of the variable is location short. Type I can just keep it string, and default value for my location is West Europe. So default value of the location short would be WEU for the short form of the location. And I can also put the validation condition and all just to accept the short form of these locations, but that is something you guys can do and do as a practice, so you can also know like how the validation works. For now, I'm just going to define this or declare this variable, and then I'm going to define the value of this variable, and that would be the West Europe. But if you see the naming convention, I can't replace it as a var.location short, right? Because it's just a part of the naming convention. It's not a whole naming convention. So if I wanted to put something as a prefix or suffix of my variable, how I can do that? To achieve this, we are using the variable interpolation. And it's just not for the variable, but for any other references as well, which I'm going to show you. But first, let's have a look how I can do the interpolation with the variable. So this is what I'm going to replace. So to replace this short form of the name or short form of the location in the naming convention of the resource, the first thing, to use the variable in between of any string, what you have to do is you have to use the dollar sign, then curly braces, then the name or the reference of your variable, which is var.location short, right? Then closing the curly braces, and that's it. So to use the variable in between of any string, what you can do is you can define the string with inverted comma and then the string, and then with dollar curly braces on, reference of your variable, curly braces close, the rest of the string is a suffix, and then closing the inverted comma. This thing called variable interpolation. We are interpolating the variable. We are adding some prefix or suffix into the variable. That is what I can do with the help of the variable interpolation. Let me replace it everywhere. So I'll just quickly find and replace it with this reference, the WEU, and I have just replaced it and save my file. I can quickly see, yes, everything it looks good. Now, first let's run the Terraform plan command, because the interpolation or the location short is already what we already applied. So technically my Terraform plan should be no changes required. But in the next plan, before running the next plan, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the location with East US, and at the same time, I'm going to replace the location short as well. So there is no infrastructure changes. Now let me change the location. So if I'm changing the location East US, and then I'm using the location short form, that is EUS, and I'll quickly run the Terraform plan command here. And now the naming convention along with the location of the resource should also be updated. So with the help of the variable interpolation, we can have any prefix or suffix on our variable, or we can use variable in between of any string. So let's have a look to the name. Yeah. So I'll just take the one of the reference of the subnet. So the new subnet, because plus represent this resource is going to be create. So the new name of the subnet will be the EUS, which I am defining here. So with the help of the variable interpolation and with the help of the variable, what I did is I have a way to centralizely manage the location short and the location of the resources. So I don't have to come to the code, because let's assume if I'm deploying all the resources, there will be hundreds of resources. And this location short, I'll have to update on 100 times if I'm changing the location, which is not a wise way to do. And that's why we are doing the variabilization to manage or to maintain all these values on a centralized level. And we do have the center of like the 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 location and the location short here in the terraform.tf was where we can just change the value and we can provide the value here and it will be our source of truth. So these two values are our source of truth. Whatever we are going to replace here, it will be implement or it will be impact the whole code of the main.tf file. Even if it's 100 resources or 1000 resources, we just have to change this value and it will be updated to all the resources. So this is how the variable interpolation works. Now let me do one more thing. I just want to have the whole name, so I can see the name also considered or name also have the environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define one more or declare one more variable called environment. Okay, and type I'm going to use the string. Default environment name, I just wanted to use the test. If someone is not providing the environment name, then it should be the test. And I can also put the validation to make sure that there is no differences in an environment name, because I face this issue, like sometimes people type the whole name of the environment like TEST. Sometimes they are just putting the TST, sometimes they are just putting the T. So I just don't want this kind of like discrepancies in my code or my resources. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the validation condition that this is the only valid values we do have for the environment, tst prod uat or sandbox. Okay, so now I do have one more variable called terraform variable environment var.environment, which I can use here, and I can pass the value for the environment is tst. Right now what I can do is in the main.tf file I can see the location short and the environment are together. So instead of like using the name here, what I can do is I can assign this value as a naming convention here, and I can define the variable naming convention here, and I'll just keep it simple string. Okay, and now I wanted to assign the value called naming convention, which will be combination of test and location short, because I can see the name of uh, the resource name is tst and then the location short. So these two things I can replace with the naming convention. So let me do that. Var dot environment, and I can use the interpolation here as well. So this would be, and then this will be my var dot location short. So instead of like having these two things again and again in my main.tf, I just have a combined variable naming convention which will have the combination of environment hyphen location. And now in the main.tf, what I'll do is I'll just replace this value, this whole value, with naming convention. Okay, so now I can manage these two things combinedly from here. I can pass the value here, and then there will be a third value called naming convention, which will be the combination of the environment and the location short, and it will be replaced here everywhere in the resource group, subnet, and here and the network security group. So everywhere now the naming convention variable will be taken into the consideration, and all the values will be replaced. Now let's have a look, will it work or not? First, what I wanted to do is I just revert the value of the base 0 and WEU. Just wanted to make sure this thing is working or not. It will not work, and I'll tell you why. But first, let's run and see if it is going to work or not. So the first thing is the condition itself is failed because when I was defining the variable, I didn't replace it with the environment. So this is good. Now let's run the Terraform plan command and see the Terraform view. Okay, variable name may not be used here. Why? We do have the variable, we do have the definition, everything is satisfied, the condition is correct, and everything is good. Then why the naming convention can't be assigned in this way? So The answer to this issue is you can't use the naming convention of the variable, one variable, into the assignment of another variable. So basically, I can't have the naming convention assignment with the environment and the location shot. That is the limitation of the variable. You can use the variable whatever you want. You can type it, like instead of doing this, what I can do is I can use something like this. That will work. That will for sure work. But if you wanted to take a reference of one variable into the another variable, it is not going to work. Like let's assume in the tag I wanted to use var.environment here, something like this. It is not going to work because you can't assign the value of a variable with reference to the another variable. That is not going to work. To resolve this issue, what we could do is we can use the local variable, and we talked about it. So yes, local variable is what you can utilize to refer the value of one variable into the another variable. So instead of defining this naming convention as a variable, as a normal variable, what I can do is I can define it as a local variable. And the good practice to have the local variable in a separate file. So let me create the file called locals.tf, and instead of defining this naming convention variable as a normal variable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this variable as a local variable. And to define the local variable, as I already mentioned, there is a local block where you can have the all the local variables. So let me save this, and then this is the local variable I'm going to use. So I just move the naming convention as a local variable. And the beauty of the local variable is, it's beauty or not, but yeah, it's a easy way, I would say. So local variable, you don't have to declare it. I don't have to declare anything or provide any property. You can just simply use the name of the variable and assign the value of the local variable. It's that simple. You don't have to declare it, you don't have to put the type, you don't have to put the validation, nothing. So there are the pros and the cons as well with this local variable. Pros is you can refer one variable into the another. Even you can refer the one local variable into the another one. So let's assume I do have a variable called sample, and I wanted to put some test value and use the another local variable here as a suffix or prefix. So in the same way of the interpolation, I can use, and to use the local variable, we always do the local dot, not the var dot, but the local dot, and this naming convention like this. So the benefit of the local variable is you don't have to define any schema, you don't have to provide the type, you don't have to put the validation condition, nothing. It's just simple. You have the locals block and simply put the name of the variable and the value. And the main benefit of the local variable is you can utilize or you can refer the var.environment or the normal variable as in reference in your local variable, like what we are doing here. For the naming convention, we are using the var.environment and the var.location short. And now to utilize it, and even one local variable can be referred into the another local variable, like what we are doing here, and in the same interpolation way. So that is how you can do the local variable things. So let me remove this, and this is what we are gonna use now. So what I'm gonna do here is, instead of typing the var.naming convention, I'm gonna replace it with local.naming convention, because local variable you always refer with local.naming convention. That is the difference between the normal variable and the local variable. Let me replace it, and now it looks good. There is no issue, nothing. Let me run the Terraform plan command, and before running the Terraform plan command, just wanted to see the value of the local variable as well. So I'm just gonna put one output block here to make sure that local variable, and the value of the local variable is local.naming convention. And if I wanted to check like how the reference of one local variable to another will work, so I'm going to define one sample and test local variable hyphen interpolation local dot naming convention. This thing you can't do with the normal variables. You can't have this kind of a thing here. So let me remove this one as well. And I can also replace the tag with the local variable, and I can refer the environment sensitivity based on the uh, local variable and based on the environment which I'm going to define here. So let's have a look. I have defined this value. I also put the output block for the sample. So let me just go to the main.tf. I'll just put another output block. Just wanted to see how it looks like, and local.sample, and then I'm going to run the Terraform plan command. Okay, there is some issue. Output variable was already defined. Okay, sorry, this is the local sample. Yeah, so that was my mistake. Local naming convention. Now let's run the Terraform plan command. Now my expectation is if I go to the terraform.tf was waste Europe is there, TST is there, it was already there before. So technically there should not be any infrastructure changes, but we have added this two output block. So there should be an output of the naming convention and the sample local variable. So let's have a look, and then we will replace these values and we'll see if it is getting into the consideration or not in the naming convention. So now with the Terraform plan, you can see the output. The local naming convention is test-weu. So if I go to here, naming convention is environment and then hyphen and then the location sort, which is WEU. Same test local variable and then test hyphen WEU, which is a reference of the naming convention. So with the help of the local variable, you can refer one local variable to the another one and normal variable into the local variable. So local variable is very powerful. However, you can't use the local variable everywhere because you don't have the declaration, you don't have the validation, you can't pass these values in the pipeline because it's not a declaration, it's just simply a key value pair, we can say, and we can use them as a local variable. So you can't pass this value, you can't pass it as an environment variable or the terraform.tf vars file or hyphen var. It's just a static variables which you can use directly. But these variables are very helpful when we are doing some combination of the different variables. Like I wanted to use the environment and location shot together. This is something I can't do with the normal variable. You can't have the reference of the normal variable, one variable to the another one. That is only possible with the locals. And in the locals, the beauty of the locals is you can also refer one local into the another one, which we have done here with the sample. So based on your use case, you identify what variable you can utilize. Now let's do a quick checkup as we already spent too much time on it. So let's have a look. I'm going to replace the location and then run the Terraform plan command. Okay. So now the value has been replaced with the East US location. It was West Europe before. So now the naming convention will be the test underscore east test hyphen East US. So that means this local variable is taking into the consideration now in my main.tf file. And that is how we can utilize the local variables. So we talked about the variable interpolation and the local variable in this section. So hope you enjoyed this session, and with this topic we have completed the variable section itself, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any question, you can always put it into the comment and I'll try to answer it as soon as possible. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next topic.